It was a sweltering hot summer day. I'm not sure exactly when it was, but it was during my high school years. I was standing at a graveside service for a family member who just passed away. Now I knew her, but as I scanned the rest of the graveyard and I read the names, I didn't know anything about those other individuals who'd long since passed away. I didn't have a clue regarding who they were, and I felt sad about it. And I remember thinking, something that would be so much more helpful is that if family and friends were to get together and just fill out some fundamental information, just enough information that would fit on the front side of a note card and securely affix it, or maybe just kind of etch it into the gravestone. Just some sort of information about the deceased. It would be interesting to know, was this guy a good man or basically a bad person? Was she fair and just, or was she unjust? Did this individual walk with the Lord, or did this person have no interest in seeking the Lord? What about their personality? It would be so fascinating to know something about their personality. I mean, what were they really like? Knowing this little bits of information would make a visit to the graveyard captivating. I mean, wouldn't it be interesting to know even some quirks and some embarrassing things about a person? Imagine reading about a woman and saying she was a horrible, hazardous driver. If you saw her coming, you'd want to get out of the way. But she could make the very best angel food cake. That recipe would knock your socks off. Or what about reading about a guy who was incredibly generous and kind, but he was always losing everything. He was misplacing his wallet, his car keys, even his shoes. If his head wasn't screwed to his shoulders, he would have lost that too. It just would be a really interesting experience, and it would make a person's family tree pop and be so much more engaging. Now, a handful of years ago, when I was taking a class in seminary, an Old Testament class, I realized that this project, this idea that I thought was novel, had already been done before. The writer of Kings, and when I say Kings, I'm referring to the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings. Originally, it was one volume. He had a formula that at least would cover the front face of a note card, basic information about each monarch of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. He had a special formula so that even if he didn't devote hardly any narrative space to a particular king, almost every single one of them could be known according to an evaluative formula that the writer had. And I'll tell you this, that as we understand that formula, we can learn so much more about the ancient kings of Israel and Judah. But you know what else we can learn? We can learn something about ourselves. Well, what is the standard that the writer of Kings uses to evaluate almost all of the kings who reigned over a united Israel, but also when the kingdom was split, and you had the northern kingdom referred to as Israel still, and the southern kingdom referred to as Judah? What was the standard? Well, the writer of Kings was a lawman, and the content of his belief and his theology and the place where he gets his standard is located in the book of Deuteronomy. And it's helpful to know a little bit about the context of the book of Deuteronomy. The children of Israel are on the cusp of entering into the promised land, the land that the Lord has set aside for them to take for themselves. They've been freed from captivity for roughly 40 years from the Egyptians, and they've been in the wilderness. And Moses, as their leader, is used of God to remind the children of Israel, hey, as you enter into the promised land, do not forget your covenant commitments. You are in a covenant relationship with the Lord, and you've got to follow his law. If you follow him and are faithful, you're going to be blessed. If you turn away from him, you're going to be cursed. You're going to be disciplined. And so he reiterates those covenant commitments to them. Now, there are quite a few of them. This is a pretty huge book of the Old Testament. But what the writer of Kings uses is he focuses in on a select few, a grouping of laws to specifically evaluate the monarchs. Well, what are those? Well, simply put, my summary is that these laws govern the worship of the Lord when they enter into the promised land. And these laws, these commandments, are found in Deuteronomy chapter 12. So I want to read those to you so you can know them. Verse 1, now this is Moses speaking on behalf of the Lord. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every tree. You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their asherim with fire. Asherim is a plural form of the name Asherah. Asherah was the female consort to the Canaanite fertility god Baal. So the Lord wants these special wooden poles to be destroyed. And you shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. You shall not act like this toward the Lord your God. So we find out, hey, when the children of Israel enter into the promised land, they're going to encounter a lot of worship spaces, a lot of altars that are dedicated to worshiping Canaanite fertility gods. These are in high places, they're on hills, and they're under a lot of different trees. The Lord wants those obliterated, completely destroyed. They simply can't be rehabilitated, and the people say, well, we're going to worship the God of Israel here. The Lord wants them completely gone, and he doesn't want to be worshiped in the same way that those Canaanite fertility gods are worshiped. Verse 5, but you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes, to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. Now, up to this point, Israel has formally worshiped the Lord in the tabernacle. That's where his presence has dwelled, near their encampment out in the wilderness. But when they enter into the promised land, he's going to set up shop in a specific place. And if you were to continue reading, my summary is the Lord goes through all the different formal acts of worship commanded in the law and even times of celebration. No, you go to that location where the Lord is worshiped. You don't go to those other places where the Canaanite fertility gods have been worshiped. Now, let's skip down to verse 13 and verse 14, and we're going to get a nice summary. Be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. This is the standard. This isn't the most obvious criteria for evaluating kings, is it? I dare say you could fill up an entire sanctuary full of people, Christians and non-Christians as well, and they would come up with a different standard for evaluating a king. I think you probably have some people who would say, look, I would want to know, is the king just? Is the king fair? Is the taxation system fair? Is the king making sure that he is not unduly influenced by outside groups when he is adjudicating cases? Is he fair? Is he going to make decisions that are in the best interest of the nation rather than his own personal enrichment or advancement? Okay, that would be a just king who would do the right thing in those situations. I think you'd find other people who'd want to know, I want to know, was this a great warrior king that we're talking about here? Okay, we're talking about the ancient world, and so the king would need to be able to protect his people in the way that a shepherd would protect his flock from wolves who come from the outside and want to terrorize them. Could this king protect his people and bring in and establish some peace for them to flourish? I think you'd have another group of people who would want to know, is the king an able politician? There's always going to be people who have different minds, different visions for which course of action to take, what the future should look like. And so a good king can get those different groups of people together to work hard to get behind one vision so that the entire nation will be blessed and everybody will be on the same page. I think you'd have other people that say, look, all that's good, but whatever you choose, I would want you to tack on a spiritual element to it. Does this king walk with the Lord in the way that Abraham did? Do they have an intimate relationship and the king trusts the Lord? Okay, you'd have different lists. So what do you think about the list that the writer of Kings goes with? Well, there is a rationale to it. You do need to keep in mind that kings, like a lot of leaders today, have incredible influence over the people that they rule. If the king can't be bothered to honor the Lord and follow his commandments, why should the rest of the people be faithful to the Lord? Obviously, there are going to be exceptions, but a lot of people will go the way of their leader or their leaders. And you also have to keep in mind that the king was thought of as God's anointed. So if he's not tearing down these sanctuaries and he's not tearing down these altars that are devoted to worshiping God's rival gods, well, then why should anyone else be bothered by it as well? I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Keith, thank you for this background information, but can you give me a concrete example of just one of these kings of Israel? Yes, I can. Yes, I can. I'm going to tell you something about Omri, okay? Just before the time of Elijah, my favorite prophet, in the northern kingdom that went by the name of Israel, there was a wicked king who passed away and passed his kingdom on to his son Elah. Elah had a captain of his chariot division, or at least half of the chariot division, named Zimri. And Zimri conspired against Elah, and he assassinated him. Now, meanwhile, the overall commander of Elah's army is out campaigning in Philistine land. You probably remember Goliath was a Philistine. These are hated rivals of Israel. So he's out fighting against the Philistines, and he hears, and all of the rest of Israel, about this assassination. So he leaves Philistine territory and he marches to the palace. And Zimri ends up burning down the palace, and in the process, he commits suicide. There's another faction that pops up, but Omri is successful in putting it down, and he becomes the undisputed king of Israel. Now, here's the thing. There's very little narrative material devoted to the life of Omri. We wouldn't know very much about him if all we had to go on was a little bit of information written in 1 Kings. However, we have what's called extra-biblical sources, sources outside of the Bible that tell us something about the life of King Omri. And we find out from these sources that he was a gifted king, at least in the eyes of the world. And he was a mighty warrior. Now, I already told you he was out campaigning against the Philistines. We also learn that he was able to go across the Jordan down to southeast of his kingdom and take territory away from the Moabites, okay? Territory in Moab. These are another group of people that were major enemies of Israel. So he was successful with that. But perhaps one of the greatest compliments that he could receive actually comes from Assyrian sources. In the annals of the Assyrian kings Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, we find that even after Omri has passed away, the northern kingdom was not called Israel. You know what it was called? Omri land. This guy was a mighty warrior, and he was able to expand the territory of his kingdom. But we really wouldn't know about that. And so this helps us see that the writer of Kings is not operating according to a standard that the rest of the ancient Near Eastern neighbors would have in evaluating a king. What mattered to the writer of 1 Kings and 2 Kings? What did you do regarding the high places? What did you do regarding worshiping our Lord? And this is where he failed, and this is why so little attention is devoted to him. I'm going to turn to 1 Kings chapter 16, and I'm going to begin reading to you in verse 23. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, so he was the king of the south, what do we have? We have dated when Omri became king. Omri became king over Israel in the north and reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years at Tirzah. He bought the hill Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. And he built on the hill and named the city which he built Samaria, after the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. So he was actually able to move the capital city in the northern kingdom to Samaria. Verse 25, and then we begin to get the summary of the writer's assessment of Omri. Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord and acted more wickedly than all who were before him. Well, you probably think, well, what kind of evil did this guy do? We find the answer in verse 26. For he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and in his sins, which he made Israel sin. So we see that by him doing wrong, his sins ensnared Israel and led the northern kingdom astray, provoking the Lord God of Israel with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Omri, which he did, and his might which he showed, are they not written in the books of Chronicles of the Kings, the book of Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son became king in his place. Who was Ahab? Ahab was that wicked king who married that foreign wife, Jezebel. So that should tell you something about King Ahab, but we'll talk about that another time. Who was Jeroboam, and why was it such a big sin for Omri to follow in his footsteps? Well, this king, Jeroboam, was the first king of the north. And he began to get nervous, and he was terrified that his countrymen would leave when they wanted to go worship the Lord in the place that he wanted. Remember, he wanted to be worshiped in his particular place, which became Jerusalem. There was his temple, right? He didn't want to be worshiped on all those other Canaanite high places. Jeroboam worried, Jerusalem's in the south, I'm going to lose the allegiance of my people. They're going to follow the king down there, Rehoboam. So you know what I'm going to do? I am going to create high places of my own. Whoa, that's a big sin right there, right? God doesn't want any of the high places. He sets one up in the north of his territory, Dan, and in Bethel in the south of his northern territory. But you know what? He didn't copy the design of the temple that was in Jerusalem. To make matters worse, what did Jeroboam do? He made 2 golden calves. The major sin that Israel committed when Moses was up on Mount Sinai. So he set it up for the God of Israel to be worshiped, all right, through ways that the Canaanite gods were worshiped, which were no gods at all. This was revolting to the Lord. Omri allowed this activity to go on. He did not honor the Lord. He did not tear down the high places. He did not lead people to worship the Lord where he wanted to be, in Jerusalem. And because of that, in the mindset of the writer of Kings, who was inspired by the Holy Spirit, didn't matter what Omri accomplished. It didn't matter how gifted he was as a leader and as a warrior. He fell down on what God wanted. I think most of Omri's peers, and I think even people today, would applaud him. I think many people would say, Omri, you've really done something with your life. I mean, think about what's on your resume. You were entrusted by the king to oversee his entire army. You were not part of the plot to assassinate him. No, you were faithful. And when you found out about his assassination, the children of Israel in the north rallied around you. They chose you to be their king. I neglected to mention earlier that Zimri killed not just Elah, the king, killed all of his heirs as well. And so Omri went from being a military leader to the king of Israel. In addition to that, people would applaud him for beating up on ancient Israel's enemy, the Moabites, and taking territory away from them. They would say, hey, and it's very impressive that the Assyrian Empire, which we know later on in 722 BC, defeated the northern kingdom, that even at that time, they had to respect you. They really thought you were a formidable foe. I mean, it's impressive when you think about it. But did any of that stuff really matter? No. He was a failure. He had all the ingredients to be one of Israel's greatest kings. But he wasn't faithful in worshiping the Lord in the way the Lord wanted to be worshiped. He didn't pull down the high places. He didn't point people to go down to Jerusalem and worship the Lord where the Lord wanted to be worshiped. Not only was he a failure, his neglect of being faithful to the Lord actually led the Lord's people astray into sin. This is a cautionary tale, a warning for all of us. Don't you want to accomplish something of value in the eyes of the Lord? Wouldn't you love to stand before him someday and he looks at you and he says, well done, my good and faithful servant? Well, there's a way to get there, and that is do what the Lord tells you to do. Do what the Lord tells you to do. Accept his standards for your life. This isn't easy to do. If we really think about it, wherever we go in the world today, there are going to be unwritten rules. There are going to be unspoken patterns and plans and criteria for evaluating your life. And there's going to be immense pressure to conform to it, and immense pressure that other people are going to feel as well. Now, not all of the standards are going to be bad, but collectively, they're going to fall woefully short of what the Lord is going to value. And if you're not careful, you can find yourself uncritically, not even really considering it, accepting these values, accepting these standards, and they'll drive your life, and they could very well lead you further away from the Lord. So we have to be vigilant as we live this Christian life. Look, Omri seemed to have everything going for him. Without question, he was incredibly gifted and he was incredibly accomplished. He was able to make things happen. And I guarantee you, there were a lot of people who looked up to him. A lot of people who would love to have patterned their lives after how he lived his life. But you know what? At the end of it all, he was missing the one thing that he could not go without. The one thing that really mattered. And that is a life marked by faithfulness. That is the key ingredient that he was missing. It is my prayer that at some point in the future, when people are at your funeral service, when they're at your graveside service, whether it's someone eulogizing you or people standing by your grave thinking about you, that they are thinking, a lot could be said about Jason. A lot could be said about Jane or Terry or Sarah. But one thing I know for sure, he was faithful to the tasks that the Lord put before him. She lived an obedient life according to what the Lord called her to. May those things be said of us. Hopefully at some point in the distant future, hopefully we've got a lot of life to live, but I pray that that's what people think of when they think of us. God bless you.